Have you ever met someone you couldn't stand at first, only to realize they might just steal your heart? That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a quiet little suburb just outside Portland, Oregon. I work as a graphic designer, spending my days sketching logos and dreaming up ad campaigns. It's a job I love, one that keeps me busy, but lets me call the shots on my own time. I moved into my cozy house here 2 years ago, looking for a fresh start after a string of bad dates and a life that felt a little too stuck. The neighborhood is nice, full of wooden houses with white picket fences, the kind of place where people wave hello and kids ride bikes down the street. It's peaceful, or at least it was until Jack Harper moved in next door. Jack is 35, single, and the definition of a grump. From the moment he showed up, he's been the guy who finds something to complain about every chance he gets. If it's not the sound of my dog barking, it's the way I park my car too close to his driveway. He's tall, scruffy, with these sharp hazel eyes that seem to judge you before you even open your mouth. I've spent months rolling my eyes at him, muttering under my breath every time I catch him staring from his porch. To me, he was the neighbor from hell, the kind of person who sucks the joy out of a sunny day just by existing. I figured he was just another lonely guy with too much time on his hands, nitpicking because he had nothing better to do. But here's the thing, I was wrong about him. Completely, totally, embarrassingly wrong. This story isn't just about a grumpy neighbor who drove me up the wall. It's about how one tiny gesture flipped everything I thought I knew about Jack upside down and turned him into someone I couldn't imagine my life without. I'm not talking about some fairy tale where the grouch turns into a prince overnight. No, this is real life, messy and unexpected, where feelings sneak up on you when you least expect them. Today, I'm taking you along for the ride, all 45 minutes of it, to share how Jack went from being my biggest annoyance to the guy who changed my world. It's a story about misjudgments, second chances, and maybe even a little love hiding where I never thought to look. So grab a coffee, get comfy, and let's dive in. Because trust me, if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. So picture this. I live in a little pocket of suburbia just outside Portland, Oregon, where the houses are all wood and brick with those classic white picket fences you see in movies. The streets are lined with big leafy trees that turn gold and red in the fall. And the air always smells like fresh-cut grass or rain, depending on the day. It's the kind of place where neighbors chat over mailboxes and kids leave chalk drawings on the sidewalks. My house is small, but perfect for me. A single-story cottage with a front porch where I like to sip coffee on weekends. I bought it 2 years ago after deciding I needed a change. A place to call my own after too many years of renting cramped apartments downtown. It's my sanctuary, or at least it was until Jack Harper showed up. I'm Emily Carter, 32 years old, and I've been a graphic designer for about 5 years now. I work for a small agency, designing everything from posters to website banners. It's creative, it's challenging, and it pays the bills, which is all I can ask for. I'm pretty independent, always have been, and I love that my job lets me set my own pace most days. After a couple of relationships that crashed and burned, I have been single for a while, focusing on myself and my little corner of the world. I've got my routines, my dog Max, who's a scrappy little terrier, and a handful of friends I see when work doesn't swallow me whole. Moving here was supposed to be my fresh start, a chance to build a life that felt like mine. But then Jack moved in next door, and suddenly my quiet little haven got a lot less quiet. Jack Harper's 35, single. Let's just say he's not the warm and fuzzy type. He showed up about 6 months ago, renting the house right next to mine. The first time I saw him, he was unloading boxes from a beat-up pickup truck, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a scowl that could scare off a sunny day. He's tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark, messy hair and these sharp hazel eyes that always seem to be sizing you up. He's not bad looking, I'll give him that, with a rugged kind of charm if you squint hard enough. But any points he might have scored for looks went out the window the second he opened his mouth. Jack's the guy who grumbles about everything. If my dog Max barks at a squirrel, Jack's out on his porch, muttering about noise. If I leave my car parked an inch too close to his driveway, he's knocking on my door with a lecture about boundaries. He's even complained about the way the mailman slams the mailbox lids too loud. It started small. A few weeks after he moved in, I was watering my plants out front when he leaned over his fence and said, "You know, that hose is dripping all over the sidewalk. Waste of water." I just stared at him, hose in hand, thinking, who asked you? Then there was the time I forgot to roll my trash cans back from the curb right after pickup. Jack was at my door that evening, arms crossed, saying, "They're blocking the walkway. Someone could trip." I mumbled an apology, dragged the cans back, and decided right then he was the most annoying person I'd ever met. Every time I saw him out there, standing on his porch with a coffee mug and that judgmental stare, I'd feel my blood pressure spike. He wasn't old enough to be some cranky retiree. So what was his deal? I figured he was just a guy who loved making everyone else's life harder. And honestly, I couldn't stand him. Little did I know there was a lot more to Jack Harper than his gruff exterior, and it wouldn't be long before I found out. So, by now, you've got the picture. I'm Emily Carter, living my quiet life in this Portland suburb, trying to enjoy my little slice of freedom. And then there's Jack Harper, my 35-year-old neighbor who seems to have made it his mission to point out every little thing I do wrong. For months, I managed to keep my distance, nodding politely when I had to, but mostly steering clear of him. I'd see him out on his porch, those sharp hazel eyes tracking me like a hawk, and I just grit my teeth and keep moving. I told myself he wasn't worth the energy, but all that changed one Friday night when I decided to throw a housewarming party. It wasn't even a big deal, just a small get-together to finally celebrate settling into my place. And that's when Jack and I had our first real clash. It was about a week after I'd finished unpacking the last of my boxes. I invited a handful of friends over, maybe 10 people tops, to break in the house. We had music playing, nothing crazy, just some chill indie stuff on a Bluetooth speaker. There were snacks, a few beers, and laughter spilling out onto the porch. It felt good, like I was finally making this place my own. The night was crisp, the kind of early fall evening where you can smell the leaves turning. And I was in a great mood. That is until around 9:30 when I heard a sharp knock on my door. I opened it, and there he was, Jack Harper, standing there with his arms crossed and that familiar scowl plastered across his face. He didn't waste a second. "Hey, some of us have work tomorrow. Can you keep it down?" His voice was low but firm, like he was doing me a favor by not yelling. I blinked at him, caught off guard. My friends were chatting behind me. The music wasn't even that loud. And it was barely past 9 on a Friday. "Seriously?" I said, crossing my arms right back. "It's not even late, Jack. It's a party. People have them." He didn't budge, just raised an eyebrow and said, "Well, people also need sleep. Just thought you'd want to know." I could feel my cheeks heating up, a mix of embarrassment and irritation. My friend Gina peeked over my shoulder, whispering, "Who's this guy?" It sang loud enough for him to hear. Jack shot her a look, then turned back to me. Look, just turn it down, okay? I wanted to argue to tell him to lighten up, but my guests were watching, so I forced a tight smile and said, fine, I'll lower it. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to his house. I shut the door, fuming. That night stuck with me. I turned the music down, sure, but inside I was boiling. Who did he think he was, coming over like he owned the neighborhood? It wasn't like we were throwing a rave. From then on, every little encounter with Jack felt like a jab. A few days later, I was walking Max, my little terrier, and he started barking at a squirrel. Jack poked his head out his window and called, "Can you keep that dog quiet? It's non-stop with him." I snapped back, "He's a dog, Jack. They bark. Maybe mind your own business for once?" He just shook his head and disappeared inside. Then there was the time I forgot to mow my lawn for a couple weeks. Jack knocked on my door, all serious, and said, "Your grass is getting out of control. Looks bad for the street." I stared at him, jaw tight, and said, "I'll get to it when I can. Thanks for the input." He walked off, and I slammed the door harder than I meant to. It wasn't just the nagging that got to me. Jack had this way of making me feel small, like I couldn't do anything right in his eyes. Sure, he was good looking, with that scruffy jawline and those intense eyes, but it didn't matter. Every time I saw him, I felt my guard go up. I'd catch myself glancing at him when he was out fixing his truck or watering his plants, wondering why someone that young acted so prickly. Was he just lonely? Bitter? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. Or at least that's what I told myself. "He's a jerk," I'd mutter to Max, who'd just wag his tail like he didn't believe me. Deep down, though, there was this tiny spark of curiosity. Why was he like this? What was his deal? But I shoved it aside. Jack Harper was trouble, and I wanted nothing to do with him. Or so I thought. So there I was, Emily Carter, stuck in this weird standoff with Jack Harper, my grumpy next-door neighbor, who seemed to have a problem with everything I did. After that housewarming party fiasco and a string of petty run-ins, I'd pretty much written him off as the king of killjoys. I mean, the guy was 35, not 65, but he acted like he'd been born with a clipboard and a rule book. I'd see him out there tinkering with his truck or glaring at me over the fence, and I'd just roll my eyes and keep my distance. He was good looking, sure, with that messy dark hair and those hazel eyes that could cut through you, but it didn't matter. I wasn't about to let some cranky guy ruin my peace. That is until one random Tuesday evening flipped everything I thought I knew about him upside down. It was a long day at work. I'd been hunched over my laptop for hours, tweaking a logo design for a picky client, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, all I wanted was a glass of wine and some quiet. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange over our little Portland suburb, and I trudged over to my mailbox, flipping through the usual pile of bills and junk flyers. But then I saw it, a plain white envelope with my name scratched out in messy handwriting. No stamp, no return address, just Emily, in black ink. I turned it over, and in the corner, it said, "From Jack." My stomach dropped. "Oh, great," I muttered to myself. What now? Is he mad about my recycling bin this time? I braced myself for another lecture. Maybe something about how I stacked the cans wrong, or let Max sniff his yard too long. I tore open the envelope, read D to scoff at whatever complaint he'd cooked up. But what I read stopped me cold. It was short, just a few lines scrawled across a torn piece of notebook paper. "Hey, Emily, your left brake light's been out for a week now. Thought you should know before it gets you a ticket or worse. Jack." That was it. No attitude, no snarky jab, just a plain, simple heads up. I stood there in the driveway, rereading it, my brain scrambling to catch up. This wasn't what I expected from Jack Harper, the guy who'd spent months nitpicking every move I made. I walked over to my car, popped the trunk, and checked the brake light. Sure enough, it was dead. I pressed the pedal a few times with my hand on the light, and nothing. Completely out. How had I not noticed? And more importantly, how had he? For a second, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, toss the note in the trash, and pretend it never happened. But another part, the part that was still reeling from the shock, felt this tug of gratitude I couldn't ignore. Jack didn't have to do that. He could have let me drive around like an idiot, racking up a fine, or getting pulled over. But he didn't. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed the note, stuffed it in my pocket, and marched across the lawn to his house. My heart was pounding a little, which annoyed me. Why was I nervous? This was just a thank you, not a peace treaty. I knocked on his door, 3 quick raps, and waited. Jack opened it after a moment, looking mildly surprised to see me standing there, and he was in a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, a smudge of grease on his forearm, like he'd been messing with something mechanical. Those hazel eyes locked onto mine, and for once, they didn't feel like daggers. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What's up?" I held up the note, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got your letter about the brake light. Just wanted to say thanks." He blinked, then shrugged like it was no big deal. "Yeah, well, I noticed it flickering last week, and it's been out since. Didn't want you getting stuck on the road or anything." His tone was casual, but there was something softer in it, something I hadn't heard before. I nodded, not sure what to say next. I didn't even know it was out. "So, yeah, I appreciate it." He scratched the back of his neck, looking almost awkward. "No problem. I used to fix cars for a living, so I catch stuff like that. Seen too many people get in trouble over dumb little things. That caught me off guard." Jack, a mechanic. It made sense, I guess, with the way he was always tinkering with that truck of his, but I'd never bothered to ask. "Oh," I said, feeling a little dumb. "That's cool. Well, thanks again." I started to turn away, but then he spoke up. "Hey, you want a beer? I've got some in the fridge. Figured since you're here." I froze, my brain short-circuiting. Jack Harper, the guy I'd spent months avoiding, was inviting me in for a drink. It was so out of left field, I almost laughed. But there was this easy grin tugging at his lips, the first real smile I'd ever seen on him, and it threw me. Sure," I heard myself say before I could talk myself out of it. "Why not?" He stepped aside, motioning me in, and I followed him into his living room. It was sparse, but tidy. A couch, a TV, a few car magazines scattered on the coffee table. He grabbed 2 beers from the kitchen, handed me one, and we sat there, sipping in this weird, quiet truce. We didn't talk much at first. I asked about his mechanic days, and he told me he'd worked in a garage for years before burning out and moving here for a quieter life. "Didn't expect to turn into the neighborhood watchdog, though," he said with a dry chuckle. I smirked. "Yeah, you've got a talent for it." He laughed, a low, rough sound that made my stomach flip a little. And that's when I noticed it, this tiny shift. Jack wasn't just some jerk. He was rough around the edges, sure, but there was something genuine under all that grumbling. As I sat there, beer in hand, watching him lean back with that easy grin, I thought, okay, maybe he's not so bad. Little did I know that one note and this awkward little chat were about to change everything between us. So there I was, Emily Carter, sitting in Jack Harper's living room with a beer in my hand, feeling like I'd just stepped into some alternate reality.
After months of thinking he was the grumpiest guy on the planet, that little note about my brake light had cracked open a door I didn't even know existed. Jack, my 35-year-old neighbor, who I'd pegged as a total pain, wasn't just some naggy watchdog. He'd noticed something I hadn't cared enough to tell me. And now, here we were, chatting like it wasn't the weirdest thing in the world. That night didn't turn me into his biggest fan overnight, but it definitely made me curious. Who was this guy really? And why did I suddenly care? Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention, and what I saw changed everything. It began with little things. A couple days after the beer chat, I caught Jack out front, helping Mrs. Linda from across the street. Her kitchen sink had sprung a leak, and there he was, toolbox in hand, fixing it like it was no big deal. She thanked him with a plate of cookies, and he just shrugged, same as he'd done with me. Then there was the time I saw him in the park, tossing a ball with some neighborhood kids whose bike tire he'd patched up earlier. He didn't smile much, but they were laughing, and he kept at it until they ran off to play something else. I started noticing how he'd shovel the walkway for old Mr. Tom next door whenever it rained too hard, never making a fuss about it. Jack wasn't loud about helping, didn't fish for praise. He just did it. And every time I saw it, I felt this weird tug, like maybe I'd been too quick to slap a label on him. I still thought he was prickly. Don't get me wrong, he'd grumble if Max barked too loud, or if someone left their trash cans out too long. But now I couldn't help wondering if there was more to it. One Saturday morning, I was out watering my plants when Jack came over, holding a sketch pad. "Hey," he said, looking a little sheepish. "I'm fixing up my garage, maybe turning it into a side gig for car repairs. Could use a logo. You're a designer, right?" I was thrown for a second. Jack Harper asking me for help. "Yeah, I am," I said, setting down the hose. "What's your vibe? Something tough? Simple?" He nodded. "Exactly. Nothing fancy." I smirked. "Fits you." He grinned back. Just a flicker. But it hit me square in the chest. "Come over later," he said. "We can figure it out." That afternoon, I went to his place with my laptop and some rough ideas. His garage was a mess of tools and car parts, but it had this organized chaos I kind of liked. We sat on his porch, tossing ideas back and forth. I'd suggest something sleek. He'd counter with something grittier, and we'd bicker like kids over it. "No way. Too flashy," he'd say, and I'd fire back. "You want boring? Fine, but it's your loss." It was fun, actually, and I caught myself laughing more than I expected. Jack wasn't smooth or charming in some polished way, but he had this dry humor that snuck up on you. By the time we settled on a design, a simple wrench and tire combo with his initials, the sun was setting, and I realized I didn't want to leave. A few days later, I got my chance to dig deeper. I was walking Max in the park when I saw Jack sitting on a bench, scribbling in that sketch pad. I wandered over, curious. "What's that?" I asked, nodding at the pad. He hesitated, then flipped it to show me. It was a rough drawing of an old Mustang, all sharp lines and detail. "Just messing around," he said. "Used to draw cars when I was a kid." I sat down next to him. "You're good. Why'd you stop?" He looked out at the trees, quiet for a beat. "Life, I guess. Worked as a mechanic for years, then it got heavy." I tilted my head. "Heavy how?" He took a breath, then said, "Lost my girlfriend a while back. Car accident, brake failure, messed me up." My stomach sank. Suddenly, all those little complaints, the way he'd fuss over details, clicked into place. "I'm so sorry," I said, meaning it. He shrugged, but his eyes were softer. "It's why I notice stuff like your light." "Can't help it." I nodded, feeling this ache for him. "Makes sense." We sat there, the silence stretching out, but it wasn't awkward. It was real. And then something shifted. I don't know when I started seeing Jack differently, but it was happening. He wasn't just the grump next door anymore. He was a guy who'd been through hell and still showed up for people in his own quiet way. The real turning point came a week later. It was pouring rain, and I'd gotten caught outside, fumbling with my keys after a late night at the office. I was soaked, swearing under my breath, when Jack appeared out of nowhere, holding an umbrella over me. "You're gonna drown out here," he said, voice gruff, but steady. I looked up, rain dripping off my hair, and he was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Thanks," I mumbled, my heart doing this dumb little flip. He walked me to my door, keeping the umbrella steady, and when we got there, he lingered. Our eyes locked, just for a second, and I felt this pull I couldn't shake. "Night, Emily," he said, stepping back into the rain. "Night," I replied, watching him go, my pulse racing. As I shut the door, I leaned against it, reeling. Jack Harper, the guy I'd spent months hating, had just turned my world upside down with an umbrella and a look. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something there, something real. Was I falling for him? Maybe. All I knew was I didn't mind getting caught in the rain if he was the one holding the umbrella. And from that moment, things between us started to change, slow and steady, like a spark catching fire. So, there I was, Emily Carter, standing at my front door with my heart pounding, after Jack Harper walked away in the rain, umbrella in hand. That moment under the downpour wasn't just about getting out of the wet, it was the spark that lit something between us. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. I'd spent months thinking Jack was the grumpiest guy alive. This 35-year-old neighbor who'd nag me about every little thing. But after that note about my brake light, our late night chats, and him opening up about losing his girlfriend, I saw him differently. He wasn't just some jerk. He was rough, sure, but under that tough shell was a guy who cared in ways I'd never expected. And now, with that umbrella still dripping in my mind, I knew things were shifting fast. It didn't happen all at once. Jack and I didn't leap into some big romantic scene right after the rain. It was slower, steadier, like the way you build a fire from a flicker to a flame. A few days later, I ran into him outside while I was walking Max. He crouched down to scratch Max's ears, something he'd never done before, and said, "He's not so bad when he's not yapping." I laughed. "High praise from you." He grinned, that rare little smirk that was starting to grow on me, and asked, "Coffee tomorrow?" My treat. I said yes before I could overthink it. And just like that, we had our first real date. We went to this little diner down the road. Nothing fancy, just greasy hash browns and strong coffee. We talked about everything, my design job, his mechanic days, even the dumb stuff, like how he hated pineapple on pizza. It was easy, natural, and I caught myself staring at him a little too long when he wasn't looking, and from there it snowballed. Jack started coming over to my place with his toolbox, offering to fix little things like the squeaky hinge on my back door. I'd bring my laptop to his garage, see the sketching while he tinkered with an old carburetor, and we'd trade playlists or argue about which 80s movie was the best. One night we ended up on my couch watching Die Hard, which he insisted was a Christmas movie. I teased him mercilessly
and he tossed a popcorn kernel at me, laughing when I yelped. Somewhere between the explosions on screen and the way his arm brushed mine, I realized I wasn't just falling for him. I was already there.
Portland, I mean, no
Jack
disrespect,
Harper,
but you've
the
gone
guy I'd once
crazy
wanted
with the
to
stuff that
strangle,
you do.
was now
I mean, no
the guy I
disrespect,
couldn't
you
wait
guys
to
have
see
no
every
idea
day.
because you're in a bubble,
The
and we all
neighborhood
sit out
noticed
here
too.
looking in, and we
Mrs. Linda caught us chatting on my porch one morning and winked at me later, saying, "He's a good one. Emily just needs a nudge." Even old Mr. Tom, who barely talked to anyone, gave me a knowing nod when he saw Jack carrying my groceries inside. It was funny, watching people figure out that the grump next door and I were a thing. But the real test came when I decided to throw a barbecue for the block. I'd been in the house almost a year, and I figured it was time to bring everyone together. I told Jack about it over coffee, half expecting him to grumble about the noise. Instead, he said, "I'll handle the grill. You're not burning down the street on my watch." I laughed, surprised, and said, "Deal." The day of the barbecue was perfect, sunny, with a cool breeze. I set up tables in my backyard, strung some lights, and put out chips and lemonade. People trickled in, Mrs. Linda with her famous potato salad, Mr. Tom with a 6-pack of soda, kids running around with Max chasing after them. Jack showed up in a clean flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, and took over the grill like he'd been born for it. He flipped burgers, cracked jokes with the dads, even let the kids poke at the coals under his watch. I stood there, watching him. This guy who'd once stormed my party to complain, now the heart of the whole thing. Mrs. Linda sidled up to me and whispered, "Told you he's a keeper." I smiled, feeling my cheeks heat up. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." As the sun dipped low, Jack wandered over with 2 plates of food, handing me one. We sat on the porch steps, eating in comfortable silence while the party hummed around us. "Not bad," he said, nodding at the crowd. "You're good at this." I bumped his shoulder with mine. "You're not so bad yourself." He looked at me then, those hazel eyes soft in the twilight, and I felt this warmth I hadn't known I was missing. That night, after everyone left, he stayed to help me clean up. We stacked chairs, tossed trash bags, and when it was done, he pulled me into a hug, simple and steady. "Thanks for this," he said into my hair. I hugged him back, thinking, "No, but thank you." Looking back, that barbecue was more than just a party. It was the moment I knew Jack and I were real, not just some fluke. He'd gone from the neighbor I couldn't stand to the guy I couldn't imagine my life without. And it taught me something big. I judged him so fast, painted him as this grouch without ever looking closer. But Jack wasn't mean. He was just rough around the edges, shaped by a past that made him care in his own quiet way. Love doesn't always show up polished and perfect. Sometimes it's messy, unexpected, hiding behind a scowl or a clipped comment. I learned that with Jack, and it's a lesson I'll carry forever. Don't write people off too quick. You might miss out on something amazing, maybe even someone who'll stand by you in the rain. So that's my story, folks. I'm Emily Carter, and I just took you through the wild ride of how Jack Harper went from being the neighbor I couldn't stand to the guy who stole my heart. It's funny to think about now, how I used to dread seeing him on his porch, those hazel eyes glaring at me over every little thing. I had him pegged as this grumpy 35-year-old killjoy who lived to make my life harder. But then came that note about my brake light, those late night talks, the rain-soaked umbrella moment. And suddenly, he wasn't just the grump next door. He was Jack, the guy who'd been through hell and still showed up for people, The guy who flipped my whole world around. From enemies to lovers, we found something real in the unlikeliest place. Right here in this little Portland suburb. Looking back, it's kind of amazing how it all unfolded. 1 minute, I'm slamming my door after he nags me about my lawn. The next, I'm sitting on his couch, arguing about movies or laughing over burgers at a barbecue. Jack didn't change who he was, not really. He's still rough around the edges, still grumbles if Max barks too loud or if the mailman's late. But I get it now. That's just him, and I wouldn't trade it. We're together for real these days, sharing coffee in the mornings, fixing up his garage, building a life one messy, perfect step at a time. It's not some big dramatic fairy tale, but it's ours. And that's enough. I never thought I'd fall for the guy I once wanted to avoid at all costs. But here we are. Proof that love shows up where you least expect it. What blows my mind most is how wrong I got him at first. I judged Jack so fast, slapped a label on him without ever asking why he was the way he was. That note about my brake light wasn't just a heads up. It was a wake-up call for me. It made me stop, look closer, and see the guy behind the grumbling. He'd lost someone he loved to a stupid car accident. And instead of shutting down, he kept an eye out for everyone else. That's who Jack is. And I almost missed it because I was too busy being annoyed. It's a lesson I'll never forget. People aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the ones who rub you the wrong way are the ones who will surprise you most. Maybe even change your life if you give them a chance. I'd love to hear from you guys now. Have you ever had a Jack in your life? Someone you couldn't stand at first, only to realize they were worth knowing. Maybe it turned into love, like mine did. Or maybe it was just a friendship you didn't see coming. Drop your stories in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. It's crazy how often we misjudge people, right? I mean, I spent months thinking Jack was my enemy when he was really just a guy with a big heart and a lousy way of showing it. So next time you meet someone who gets under your skin, maybe pause, look a little closer. You never know what you might find. Thanks for sticking with me through this 45-minute journey. It's been a blast sharing how Jack and I went from butting heads to building something real. If you loved this story, hit that like button. It means the world to me. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Tap that bell so you don't miss what's next. Speaking of next, I've got another tale coming your way soon. Ever wonder what you'd do if you found a mystery box in your basement? That's what I stumbled on last month, and trust me, it's a wild one. I'll spill all the details in the next video, so stay tuned. For now, thanks again for watching. You guys are the best. Catch you in the comments, and I'll see you soon.